A racist and corrupt cop attacked a black woman inside a courtroom, but froze in shock when she struck back, and revealed she was actually his boss. It started with a trial that was supposed to be routine. A hallway, tense but quiet. A court session, just another day on the docket. The officer walked in with the kind of arrogance that only comes from years of getting away with everything. He didn't just see himself as the law, he believed he was the law. So when his eyes landed on a black woman sitting silently in the courtroom gallery, dressed in plain clothes, no badge, no rank showing, just presence, he didn't see someone worth respecting. He saw someone to dominate. Someone to humiliate. And the way he moved toward her made it clear, he had no idea who she truly was. The courtroom hadn't even come to order when it happened. She stood to ask a question, something minor, procedural. But for him, that was enough. He crossed the floor, chest puffed, eyes filled with disdain, and said the words that ignited the room, "Sit down. You don't speak unless spoken to. Who let you in here anyway?" His voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. She didn't flinch. She looked him dead in the eyes and responded, calmly, "I'm here in an official capacity." But that only fueled him more. His tone turned cruel, laced with something darker than just arrogance, it was hate wrapped in a badge. "Official? You? In what world? You don't look like anything but a problem." Gasps came from the back of the courtroom. Even the judge paused his movement. But the officer didn't stop. He stepped closer. Too close. Then, without warning, shoved her shoulder, hard, knocking her backward into one of the wooden benches. The sound echoed. A silence fell over the room so loud it rang in people's ears. That's when she stood up, slowly, dusting herself off, blood at the corner of her lip. And in a voice steady, sharp, and unforgiving, she said the words that would haunt him forever, "You just assaulted your superior officer." In front of a judge. In a federal courtroom. "Congratulations, officer, you just ended your career." For a split second, his face was blank. Then confusion. Then panic. Then the realization that every person in that room, every set of eyes on him, wasn't just witnessing a meltdown, they were witnessing a reckoning. The judge ordered silence, but the damage was done. Cameras had already started recording. Cell phones were lifted. The internet would explode within the hour. And the officer? He tried to speak, to defend, to backpedal. But there was no ground left to stand on. The truth unraveled fast after that. He wasn't just a bad cop. He was corrupt to the bone. Years of misconduct reports hidden. Complaints from black and brown citizens swept under the rug. Internal Affairs had tried, and failed, to bring charges multiple times. Why? Because he had connections. Because he was protected. Until now. Until she walked into that courtroom not as a witness. Not as a victim. But as the new director of Internal Affairs. His boss. His silent observer. And now, his judge. But the most brutal part of all. She didn't just show up to witness him. She came to expose him. This wasn't an accident. It was a setup. A trap. Months in the making. Every word he said, every step he took, every aggressive move, it was all recorded. He handed her everything she needed to bury him, and he did it with a smile on his face, thinking he was putting another black woman in her place. Instead, he put himself in the crosshairs of justice. The days that followed were chaos. Headlines screamed for accountability. The department scrambled to control the narrative. But it was too late. The footage was everywhere. Civil rights groups rallied. Protests sparked again. And the woman he tried to humiliate became a symbol of silent power, of what happens when the overlooked rise up. Still, the story didn't end there. Because the most shocking moment wasn't the courtroom assault, or the reveal of her true identity. It wasn't even the fall from grace he suffered in public. It was what she did next. She held a closed-door hearing. No cameras. No reporters. Just her, him, and a file that could ruin more than his reputation. It could dismantle every crooked favor, every buried complaint, every officer he protected over the years. And in that room, she gave him a choice. A final sentence. But what she said, shocked even those who thought they had seen it all. Why did she do it? What was in that file? What secret did she use to bring down not just him, but an entire system of abuse? And most importantly, what did she say in that last moment, that made him, a man who thought he could never be touched, break down in tears? Stay with us. Because this isn't just about revenge. It's about justice served cold, by the very person they tried to silence. The end will leave you breathless. Before we begin, a quick but important message, to every black viewer watching this: we see you, we stand with you, and we support your right to live with dignity, justice, and respect. Plow of Twist does not tolerate or promote any form of racism or discrimination. Stories like the one you're about to hear are a reminder that truth and justice always find their way, no matter how long it takes. You're not alone. Keep rising. Now sit back, get ready for a powerful ride, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional plot twists like this one. Enjoy the story. The morning air in Richmond, Virginia, carried that uneasy stillness that sometimes precedes a storm, not the kind that brews in the clouds, but the kind that simmers in people. The city was waking up like it always did, the hum of buses, the shuffle of sneakers on sidewalks, 100,000 lives moving in rhythm. But behind the polished glass of the downtown courthouse, where so much of the city's fate had been decided and erased, something else was brewing. And it all started with a woman named Camille. Camille Harris didn't walk into rooms to be noticed. She walked in to observe. To read the energy, to learn who held power and who pretended to. She had always known how to blend in, how to sit in a corner of a room and make herself invisible, even when everything about her presence demanded attention: her eyes, her poise, her silence that was never submissive, only calculating. Camille had learned from a very young age what it meant to be underestimated, what it meant to be talked over, dismissed, looked at like you didn't belong. And she had turned that into her superpower. While people were busy ignoring her, she was gathering everything she needed to one day hold all the cards. She was in her early 40s, striking in a quiet way, with natural curls pulled back into a low bun and eyes that made people uncomfortable when they realized she didn't blink often. She had been raised by her grandmother in the south side of Richmond, in a neighborhood that the city had long given up on. Her grandmother, Miss Thelma, was the kind of woman who'd march into a principal's office wearing a church hat and a full apron if she heard someone disrespected Camille. She believed in hard work, faith, and never letting your pain turn you bitter. Camille carried that legacy in everything she did, but unlike her grandmother, she also knew when it was time to stop turning the other cheek. Camille's career had been the result of grit, intelligence, and quiet rebellion. She didn't scream to be heard, she made herself undeniable. From the moment she stepped into law enforcement, she was told she'd never last. Too soft, too quiet, too black, too much. But she outworked, outsmarted, and outlasted every single man who tried to keep her down. By the time she was promoted to Director of Internal Affairs for the Federal Oversight Division, she had earned a reputation across state lines, not just as a brilliant investigator, but as a woman who knew how to listen. She had built her entire department from the ground up with that same principle: let them think you're not paying attention. Let them talk. Let them slip. Then move in silence, and strike with truth. Across the city, in a different kind of world, there was Officer Jack Whitaker. Blonde, broad, and loud. He was the face of a very different kind of power. A police officer for nearly 20 years, Jack was what many in the community called untouchable. The kind of man who showed up on the news shaking hands with mayors, handing out school backpacks, hugging kids at the precinct, but whose name lived like a ghost in whispered conversations in black barbershops and community centers. People had stories about Jack. Stories of harassment, of humiliation, of threats that never made it to paper. But complaints went nowhere. Reports vanished. Witnesses were pressured. Every time he was accused, he was cleared. Every time someone spoke up, they were told it was a misunderstanding or lacked sufficient evidence. Jack had friends in high places, friends who owed him favors, friends who were afraid of what he might say if pushed too far. He believed in order. His order. He believed the world worked better when people knew their place. And he believed people like Camille were the problem. Women who didn't flinch. Black professionals who refused to be grateful just for being allowed in the room. He despised them, though he'd never say it aloud. But his actions, his smirks during traffic stops, his tone when addressing black defendants, his eyes when he stared down at women, spoke volumes. Jack didn't need to scream to be threatening. He had a badge, and in his mind, that made him invincible. Their paths had never crossed directly until that day in the courthouse. But Camille had known of him long before he even knew her name. She had read the reports that never made the news. She had sat with families whose cases were marked closed due to lack of evidence. She had heard the pain in the voices of people who were tired of being invisible. And she had waited. She didn't believe in rushing justice. She believed in building it, one piece at a time, until it couldn't be ignored. So when she heard Jack would be testifying in a procedural hearing at the Richmond courthouse, representing the department in a public dispute over excessive force, she made a decision. She would be there. Not as Director Harris. Not as the badge. But as a woman in the gallery. Watching. The courtroom that morning was ordinary. Marble floors, fluorescent lights, a smell of cold coffee and nerves. Lawyers shifted papers. The judge arrived 5 minutes late. A handful of reporters sat in the back row, hoping for something worth writing about. Nobody noticed Camille as she took her seat in the middle of the room, wearing jeans, a soft gray sweater, and simple earrings. No makeup. No fanfare. Just presence. She watched as Jack entered with his usual strut, nodding at the bailiff like an old friend, ignoring the few protesters gathered outside. He scanned the room like it belonged to him. And then, his eyes landed on her. She didn't speak. Didn't flinch. But something in her posture seemed to irritate him. Maybe it was how she looked at him, like she wasn't afraid. Maybe it was the calm. Or maybe he just needed someone to remind him of his place, as he saw it. He walked over to her, unprovoked. Towered above her. He asked what she was doing there. When she didn't answer fast enough, his tone changed. He told her this wasn't a place for the public to speak. That people like her always tried to make a scene. That she needed to leave before she embarrassed herself. His words weren't loud, but the courtroom had quieted. People were watching now. Camille stood slowly. Told him she wasn't breaking any rules. That she had a right to be there. Jack stepped closer. Too close. His voice dropped low, venomous. You people always think you're owed something. Let me guess, you're here to cry racism again. It wasn't the words that hit the hardest. It was the dismissiveness. The ease with which he said it, like he had said it before, like it meant nothing. Then, he did the unthinkable. He placed his hand on her shoulder, gripped tight, and shoved her back into her seat. It wasn't violent in the way most people think of violence. But it was enough. Enough to humiliate. Enough to draw blood on her lip. Enough to silence the room. Camille sat there for a moment. Breathing. Collecting. And then, with all the steadiness in the world, she stood back up. Looked him in the eye. And smiled, not with joy, but with clarity. And that was the moment everything shifted. But no one in that courtroom, not the judge, not the press, not even Jack, had any idea what they were about to witness in the hours and days that followed. They didn't know the woman he had just humiliated wasn't just a bystander. They didn't know she had built the case that would bring him down. They didn't know she had been planning this moment for months. What they saw was a woman in plain clothes. What they missed was the storm she carried. And as the truth began to unravel, piece by piece, the city of Richmond would be forced to reckon not just with one man's corruption, but with an entire system built to protect him. And the only question left to ask was, when justice finally speaks, will it be loud enough to silence him forever? The hours following the courtroom incident unfolded like an unraveling knot, slow, tense, and impossible to ignore. Camille didn't leave the building immediately. She stood her ground, demanded to speak with the judge in chambers, and made sure her presence would not be dismissed as easily as Jack had tried to do. There was no shouting, no dramatic announcement of her title. Just quiet power and paperwork. She slid a sealed envelope across the judge's desk, and what was inside made his face go pale. He asked if she wanted to move forward with it. She said she wasn't here to want anything. She was here to ensure justice finally had a witness strong enough to speak, and not back down. The judge nodded, cleared his throat, and said he would make the necessary calls. She left the room with no expression, only purpose. The courthouse buzzed with half-sentences and speculation. No one knew exactly who she was yet, but everyone knew something had shifted. Outside, Jack laughed it off. To his fellow officers, he brushed it away like lint on a uniform. Said she was some angry woman looking for attention. That she had gotten mouthy and stepped out of line. When someone asked if he was worried about backlash, he scoffed. Please. You know how many times people have tried to come for me. She'll disappear like the rest of them. But something was different this time. The room hadn't reacted like it usually did. There were too many eyes. Too many cameras. Too much silence where there used to be applause. And the woman, she hadn't looked afraid. She had looked prepared. That stayed with him. It clung to the back of his neck like sweat, even as he joked and shrugged it all off. That afternoon, Camille returned to her office in the Federal Oversight Building under a new nameplate that had only been installed 2 weeks prior. Her staff greeted her with a subtle nod, no questions, just respect. Behind the closed doors of her office, she locked the file drawer that contained a dossier labeled JW_confidential, and exhaled for the first time all day. She stared at the file for a long moment. Not out of doubt, but to remind herself of how long she'd been building this. Every report. Every suppressed complaint. Every witness who was too afraid to speak. It was all there. Organized, dated, annotated. She had spent over 9 months collecting evidence, threading together the truths that others tried to bury. Not just about Jack, but about the network that enabled him. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her lead investigator, Ramon. Confirmation. We got the footage. Audio included. She replied only one word, proceed. Meanwhile, Jack went about his week like nothing had happened. His confidence didn't shake, not yet. He filed a brief report about a minor disruption in the courtroom. No mention of force. No mention of blood. He described Camille as non-compliant and disorderly. His supervisor signed off without hesitation. Another normal day. Another routine lie. But beneath the surface, pieces were beginning to move. The footage captured by the courtroom security cameras had already been pulled and secured. Witness statements were being quietly collected by Camille's team. Anonymous tips were being verified. There was a quiet operation unfolding, and Jack didn't even know he was at the center of it. On Thursday, Camille visited the community center in Jackson Ward, the same one where she'd once served food to neighbors as a teenager. Now, she stood in front of a small group of women and men who had filed complaints against Jack in the past. Most of them had never received a response. Some had been intimidated into silence. Others simply gave up. Camille told them the truth, that she was listening, that the case was open, and that this time, someone on the inside was fighting with them. One woman, eyes full of pain, asked what would be different now. Camille didn't promise victory. She promised visibility. That was enough to make tears fall. For the first time, these people felt seen. The next day, Jack was pulled into a closed-door meeting. It was brief. Cold. An internal investigator handed him a notice. He was being reviewed for conduct during a federal court session. He laughed in their faces. "This is a joke, right?" But no one laughed back. His partner, Officer Green, refused to make eye contact. Something in Jack's gut twisted. When he asked who filed the report, they didn't answer. But later that night, he saw her again, on the evening news. Camille stood behind a podium, not as a victim, but as a leader. The cheerin below read, "Federal Director launches oversight investigation into officer misconduct." He froze. She had never given her name that day in court. Never flashed her badge. But now, in front of cameras, she made it clear, the woman he tried to silence was the very person now holding his fate in her hands. The public response was immediate. Civil rights groups demanded transparency. Journalists dug up old complaints. Social media exploded with hashtags. Suddenly, Jack wasn't just a cop under review, he was a symbol of everything broken. And everything finally being exposed. In private, his anger turned into desperation. He called in favors. Met with old contacts. Tried to pressure Camille's office, but no one returned his calls. One night, he showed up outside the oversight building, tried to catch her as she left. Told her they could settle this quietly. She didn't even look at him when she walked past. Just said, "You don't get to decide what quiet means anymore." He shouted after her, told her she was making a mistake. But the security cameras caught every word. Every threat. Behind the scenes, Camille's case grew stronger. One by one, the dots connected. Records that had been sealed were now unsealed. Body cam footage from past incidents resurfaced. Internal memos proved there had been a cover-up. She met with the Attorney General, presented her findings. He asked if she was sure she wanted to pursue this, it would bring heat, backlash, threats. Camille looked him in the eye and said, "The heat's already here. I'm just giving it a name." By now, Jack could feel the walls closing in. His supervisors had gone silent. His union rep warned him to prepare for suspension. His daughter stopped speaking to him. She had seen the video. Asked him if it was true. He said the woman set him up. But the look in his daughter's eyes said she didn't believe him. 1 week before the final hearing, Camille sat alone in her office, reviewing the timeline. Her assistant entered with a document, one last piece of evidence. A transcript of a phone call between Jack and a fellow officer. In it, Jack laughed about how easy it was to get rid of mouthy women. He used a word Camille hadn't heard spoken in decades. A word that made her hands shake. She closed the file. Said quietly to herself, "It's time." The city buzzed in anticipation. News vans lined the courthouse steps. Protesters gathered. Supporters marched. Opponents threatened. Inside the building, Camille walked past every reporter, every camera, without a word. She wasn't here for spectacle. She was here to finish what had been started. The final hearing would be closed to the public, but its outcome would shake every pillar of that courthouse. And Jack? He sat inside, waiting. Pale. Sweating. Alone. What he didn't know, was that the worst moment of his life was just about to begin. The door closed behind Camille with a soft, deliberate click. The hearing room was silent, dim, and cold, like it had been built not for justice but for judgment. A long mahogany table separated her from the man on the other side. Jack sat there, stiff, his face pale but still trying to hold the posture of control. Two attorneys flanked him, both looking down at their folders, avoiding her gaze. Camille didn't bring lawyers. She brought truth. She sat down slowly, her fingers gliding across the edge of the documents she had laid out in front of her. No rush. No need for spectacle. Just the sound of paper sliding across wood and breath being held. Jack shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, then broke the silence. I don't know what this is supposed to be, but if it's another attempt to make this political, she cut him off, calmly but firmly. This isn't political, Jack. This is accountability. Something you've never had to face. He scoffed, leaning back like the weight of the room wasn't already pressing down on him. You think you can walk in here and humiliate me? I've served this city for 20 years. I've put away criminals. She interrupted again, but this time, she leaned forward, her voice lower, heavier. You've terrorized neighborhoods, Jack. You've threatened citizens, falsified reports, protected violent officers. And you did it all behind a badge you used like a weapon. For a moment, the room hung in thick, brutal silence. Then Camille opened the first folder, sliding it across to him. Inside were transcripts, recordings, memos, complaint letters. She let him glance down before speaking. This is from the Harris case. She was 16. You arrested her for loitering, slammed her against a patrol car, then listed her as resisting after she cried out. She opened another folder, slid it beside the first. This is from the Carson family. You raided their home without a warrant, then lied under oath to cover it up. Another folder. Here's your conversation with Officer Barrett. Recorded last year. You bragged about using unnecessary force because, in your words, they need to learn who's in charge. She kept going. Folder after folder. Story after story. Evidence after evidence. Each one another nail in the coffin he had built with his own hands. Jack's face twitched. His confidence cracked. You've been building this all along, he muttered, voice lower now, almost hoarse. You set me up. Camille looked him dead in the eye. No, Jack. You set yourself up. I just gave you the space to show everyone who you really are. One of his attorneys leaned in, whispered something quickly. Jack waved him off, eyes locked on Camille. You planned that day in the courtroom, didn't you? You wanted me to react. She tilted her head slightly. I didn't have to want anything. I knew you would. Her words weren't vengeful, they were a mirror. She wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. And that's what unnerved him more than anything. She wasn't trying to punish him. She was holding him accountable in a way no one ever had. He shifted in his seat again. So what now? You gonna fire me? Take my pension? Camille's voice didn't change tone, but it deepened in impact. You're not just being fired, Jack. You're being disqualified from any future government work, your badge is permanently revoked, and you're facing charges for obstruction of justice, falsification of records, and civil rights violations. And yes, your pension is gone. You'll leave with nothing you didn't earn honestly. Which, as it turns out, is very little. The words hit harder than any scream could have. Jack swallowed, his posture deflating. For the first time, he looked smaller. Camille leaned forward again, her eyes calm but razor-sharp. But that's not all. You see, this isn't just about you anymore. It's about the people who protected you. The ones who looked the other way. The ones who signed off on your lies. I have their names. Their emails. Their signatures. This isn't the end. It's the beginning. Jack's jaw clenched. You think this makes you a hero? Camille sat back, folding her hands. No. This makes me accountable. Something you've never understood. And something this city desperately needs. He stared at her, trying to find some piece of leverage, some weakness in her voice, some opening to crawl through. But there was none. Only the sound of inevitability. Then Camille stood. She opened one last folder, thinner than the rest. She placed a single photograph in front of him. Jack looked down and flinched. It was him, smiling at a barbecue held by the precinct years ago. His hand was resting on the shoulder of a black boy, no more than 10 years old, his eyes uncertain. This is Malik Brown. He was arrested by you 3 years after this photo was taken. He was 17. You called him a thug. Slammed him to the ground. He's now in a wheelchair. I visited him last week. He remembers you. He also remembers that you were laughing when you cuffed him. Her voice wavered, but only slightly. You stole something from that boy that he'll never get back. This isn't just paperwork, Jack. This is people. Lives. Jack looked away. Camille gathered the folders slowly. She didn't rush. Every second of silence was intentional. When she finally walked to the door, she paused with her hand on the handle. There's one last thing, she said, not turning around. You asked what happens now. In a few minutes, this room will fill with press. This hearing was recorded. The footage from the courtroom. The day you put your hands on me. That goes public today. I hope you like the spotlight. Because it's all yours. She walked out. The room stayed silent for another full minute before Jack leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. Outside, the world was already moving. Reporters gathered like sharks. Cameras blinked red. The footage Camille mentioned played on every screen, from local news to national broadcasts. The slap of his hand, the sharp sound of her body hitting the bench, the silence that followed, it all played on repeat. People watched. People remembered. But what they didn't know, what they hadn't yet seen, was that this was just the first domino. And Camille still had one final card left to play. One that would not only end his career, but expose the very foundation that had kept him safe for so long. And when that moment came, nothing in Richmond would ever be the same. The press conference began just after noon. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, camera crews, and curious citizens who had heard whispers of the scandal but were still piecing together the truth. Camille stood at the podium, dressed in a navy suit that mirrored the sky behind her, her shoulders square and her voice steady. She didn't speak for drama. She didn't speak to entertain. She spoke to make things unmistakably clear. Behind her, screens showed segments of surveillance footage, the courtroom incident, the silent freeze that followed, and the unspoken horror in the faces of those who watched. The nation was watching now. And as the video looped, Camille began to speak. She explained that this wasn't an isolated incident. That what had happened in the courtroom was not the beginning, it was the boiling point. She spoke of systemic failures, of a pattern of misconduct, of buried reports and lost evidence. But most of all, she spoke of silence. The kind that allows injustice to stretch across years, undisturbed. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of her words did all the work. Reporters didn't interrupt. Citizens didn't chant. The air itself seemed to listen. Back inside the courthouse, Jack sat slumped in a hallway chair, his eyes glued to the live feed on the TV mounted above him. Each word Camille spoke seemed to land like a punch to the chest. Her voice had no hatred, no vengeance. Just truth. And that made it worse. It stripped him of the narrative he had always clung to, that he was misunderstood, that he was protecting order, that the world was just too sensitive now. But watching her face on that screen, watching her outline the cold, surgical steps of his exposure, he realized none of that mattered anymore. He wasn't being taken down by a crowd or a riot. He was being taken down by a woman who refused to blink. Later that afternoon, a closed-door meeting was held with senior leadership from the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, and key members of Camille's Oversight Division. The goal was clear: identify the enablers. Camille arrived carrying 3 thick binders and a USB drive. She greeted everyone professionally, then laid the materials on the table like evidence at a trial. One of the DOJ officials, an older man with deep lines across his forehead, asked if she was certain. Camille looked him in the eye and said, "These names span departments, cities, and years. Every one of them signed something, ignored something, or buried something. I don't just want accountability for Jack Whitaker. I want the system that protected him to face the same light." There was silence. Then slow nods. The binder was opened. The list read aloud. It wasn't just officers. It was supervisors, internal affairs reps, clerks who falsified timestamps, chiefs who lost footage. A network. A machine. The room stiffened as the reality sank in. This wasn't a scandal, it was an unraveling. Meanwhile, Jack had been escorted home under surveillance. His name was trending across every platform. His daughter hadn't answered his texts. His voicemail was full. His front yard had become a circus. Protesters, journalists, even neighbors he had never spoken to were now standing behind caution tape, watching. He stood in his living room, staring at the darkened TV, hands shaking. He poured a drink but didn't touch it. The knock on the door came at 6:12 p.m. It was Camille. She stood on the porch, calm, alone. No reporters. No agents. Just her. Jack opened the door, confused, guarded. She didn't ask to come in. She simply said, "I need 5 minutes." Against his better judgment, or perhaps because something inside him already knew there was no point in resistance, he stepped aside. They sat across from each other in his living room, a silence between them that felt heavier than any courtroom. Camille began with no introduction. "I'm here because there's something you need to hear. Not from a file. Not from a headline. From me." Jack clenched his jaw, but didn't interrupt. She continued. "When I joined Internal Affairs, your name came up more than once. Not officially, of course. Off the record. Through stories. Through warnings. But it was the same story every time. A man who believed he was untouchable. A man who knew the system better than his victims. A man who could erase pain with paperwork." Jack leaned back, his eyes glassy. "So this is what you wanted? To sit in my house and make me feel like nothing?" Camille shook her head, her voice low. "No. I didn't come here for revenge. I came because I needed you to understand something. You didn't just hurt people, Jack. You taught others how to do it. You modeled cruelty. You normalized silence. And now that it's over, you don't get to hide behind shame or victimhood." He laughed bitterly, more to himself than at her. "I did what I was trained to do. I followed protocol." Camille's stare hardened. "No, you followed the parts of protocol that let you feel powerful. You ignored the parts that required humanity." He stood abruptly, pacing now, hands on his head. "You don't get it. You don't know what it's like in the field. You sit in your office reading files, but out there, it's war." Camille didn't move. "It's not war, Jack. It's a community. You were never supposed to be at war with them. But you made them your enemy." He paused, his back to her. Then, in a voice she didn't expect, soft and cracked, "I don't even know when it started, when I started feeling like I was better than them. Like they owed me something. Maybe it was the first time someone backed me up when I crossed a line. Maybe it was when I realized no one cared enough to stop me." Camille stood now too, stepping closer, her voice no longer just professional, it was human. And every time that happened, another person lost faith in justice. Another kid learned to fear the police. Another family buried anger they'd carry forever. Jack turned to her, eyes rimmed red. "You really think I can come back from this?" She looked at him, and for a moment, there was no hate. No power struggle. Just one human being staring into the broken pieces of another. "No. I don't think you can come back from this. But I think others can learn from it. And I think that matters more now." She turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. "You thought silence was your shield. But the truth speaks louder than you ever did." As she stepped outside, cameras began to click. Her face calm, her stride unwavering. The world was still watching, but now, it was watching her. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, justice didn't feel like a distant dream. It felt real. And loud. And permanent. The days following the press conference were a storm of fallout and reckoning. The video footage of Jack's assault was no longer just news, it had become a symbol, a line in the sand. Across the country, conversations ignited. Commentators dissected every frame of the courtroom video, advocacy groups used it to rally communities, and former victims of similar abuse began stepping forward with stories they'd carried in silence for years. The name Camille Harris became synonymous with accountability, not as a warrior of vengeance, but as a force of calm and principled disruption. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded chaos. She had simply allowed the truth to rise on its own. And yet, beneath the public triumph, something more complicated began to surface. Not everyone was celebrating. Inside the system she had just shaken, cracks were turning into ruptures. Officers who had once laughed with Jack now whispered in corners, unsure of their own standing. District attorneys reviewed closed cases with new eyes, wondering if they had overlooked misconduct out of convenience or pressure. Several high-ranking officials abruptly resigned, issuing vague statements about personal matters, though the public knew exactly what those matters were. Camille had not only dismantled the image of one corrupt officer, she had forced an entire institution to question its foundations. But with that impact came isolation. Camille moved through her office with an invisible wall around her. Colleagues she had mentored began keeping their distance, unsure of whether her rise meant their fall. A few even suggested, behind closed doors, that she had gone too far, that maybe her pursuit of justice had crossed into something personal. Those murmurs reached her ears, and though she never responded publicly, they lingered in the air, heavy and unjust. Because the truth was, Camille had not emerged from this unscathed. She had sacrificed more than her time, she had risked her safety, her reputation, and any illusion that you could speak truth to power without paying a price. Her dilemma was no longer just about holding Jack accountable. Now, it was about navigating the fallout of exposing a broken structure while still being expected to operate within it. There were files on her desk, cases of misconduct, abuse, corruption, that she'd flagged before the trial even began. Now, each one seemed to carry new weight. Could she keep going? Could she continue dismantling a machine she was still technically part of? The thought haunted her late at night. Every win came with the question, am I burning this down, or am I building something better? Meanwhile, Jack had disappeared from public view. Stripped of his title, severed from his community, and abandoned by the very people who once upheld him, he found himself alone in a world that no longer feared him. Rumors spread about where he'd gone, some said he fled the state, others claimed he was undergoing some kind of psychological evaluation. The truth was quieter, Jack was at home, watching his legacy unravel. Not in one moment, but slowly, through newspaper headlines, public forums, and the cold space between him and his daughter, who had moved in with her mother and hadn't called him since. He began receiving letters, some threatening, others pleading, a few simply angry. But one arrived that shook him differently. It was handwritten, and signed. Just a few lines. I remember what you did. I remember how small you made me feel. I pray every day that no one else will ever feel that way again. I hope you're watching. Because now, we are. Jack read it 3 times before folding it back into the envelope and placing it inside a drawer. He didn't tear it up. He didn't throw it away. For once in his life, he didn't erase the evidence. In the meantime, Camille was summoned to meet with a Federal Review Committee. The official reason was a strategic consultation, but she knew what it really was, a litmus test. Her success had placed her in the crosshairs of policymakers, and not all of them were fans. The room was filled with polished professionals who smiled without warmth. They praised her efforts in public but questioned her methods in private. One asked if she considered the impact her actions might have on officer morale. Another implied she had compromised neutrality by confronting Jack in his own home, even though no law had been broken. Camille responded with the same grace she had maintained throughout, but inside, she felt a deeper fatigue settling in. What they wanted, she realized, was not justice, they wanted balance. Not between right and wrong, but between comfort and consequence. They wanted a world where accountability never made anyone too uncomfortable. Camille refused to offer that. She reminded them that justice is not gentle, nor is it designed to preserve comfort. It is designed to correct. To restore. And that process, by definition, must disturb the status quo. Some nodded. Others scribbled notes. One woman stared at her for a long time, and as Camille stood to leave, she whispered, "Keep going. Even if they pretend they don't want you to." Outside the committee room, reporters waited, hoping for a quote. Camille gave none. Not yet. There were other matters pressing on her mind. One of them was a message she had received from a young woman named Ayanna, a college student who had recently filed a complaint against another officer. Ayanna said she had been inspired by Camille's stand, but now feared retaliation. She wrote, "I want to believe people like you can protect people like me. But some days, I'm scared you're the only one." Camille scheduled a meeting with her immediately. She sat across from her at a community center, listened carefully, and asked thoughtful questions. But when Ayanna asked, "What if they come for you next?" Camille didn't have a scripted answer. She simply said, "Then they'll find someone ready." That conversation stayed with her longer than she expected. It brought her back to her grandmother, to the stories of marches and fire hoses, of praying through pain, of standing up when it didn't make sense to. Camille realized that her work was no longer just about exposing what was wrong, it was about building spaces where people like Ayanna didn't have to ask that question anymore. But there was one final piece still in motion. One thread she had not yet pulled. Jack had been part of an internal task force, a private circle of officers tasked with special enforcement in high-crime areas. On the surface, it was legal. But Camille's files told a darker story. That task force had operated without oversight. Several of its members had disciplinary records that mysteriously disappeared. And Camille had evidence, emails, messages, recorded conversations, that tied Jack to a series of cover-ups within that group. She had held off on releasing it publicly, waiting for the right moment. Now, that moment had come. She called a final press briefing. Not to speak of Jack alone, but of the system he had helped fortify. She released a report outlining the inner workings of the task force, naming names, dates, and directives. She didn't just accuse, she proved. She showed the policies that were ignored, the training that was skipped, the oversight that was erased. Her voice was not filled with fire. It was calm. Surgical. Like someone removing a cancer without anesthesia, because there was no time left for gentle. The report led to immediate suspensions. A new federal investigation. Entire precincts began undergoing audits. Officers who once walked with unchecked authority now faced review boards. And Camille? She stood firm. Alone, often. But unshaken. Yet even then, the question still remained. How far is too far when seeking justice? How much should one person sacrifice in the name of accountability? How do you lead inside a system you're also dismantling? Camille didn't pretend to know all the answers. But she knew this: silence was never an option again. And in the space between consequence and redemption, she prepared for the final move. The week after Camille's final press briefing passed in a strange limbo, one where change had clearly been set in motion, but the aftershocks were still rippling through the institutions that had long resisted accountability. Camille spent most of those days behind closed doors, not hiding, but working, coordinating with federal agents, overseeing community listening sessions, and most unexpectedly, sitting down with people she never imagined would ask for a conversation. One of them was Deputy Chief Wallace, a man who had spent years looking through her like she didn't belong in the room. He requested a private meeting at the precinct, and though she could have easily declined, Camille accepted. She wasn't interested in creating enemies, she wanted transformation, no matter how uncomfortable it felt. The room was tense when she entered. Wallace didn't rise, didn't smile, but he gestured toward the seat across from him with a stiffness that wasn't quite arrogance anymore. It was something closer to uncertainty. Camille sat, folding her hands on the table, waiting. Wallace cleared his throat, then finally spoke. He said he didn't come to apologize because he figured she wouldn't care for one, and he wasn't sure she'd believe it anyway. Camille didn't flinch. He continued, slower now, confessing that he'd known about Jack's behavior for years, bits and pieces, nothing concrete, but enough to know something wasn't right. And he hadn't acted. He told himself it wasn't his job, that there were bigger problems to solve, more pressing fires to put out. But really, he said, he just didn't want to deal with the fallout. He said that watching her stand at that podium, watching her walk through the fire he avoided for so long, had forced him to see what he'd become, a man who thought survival was more important than integrity. Camille looked at him, her expression unreadable, and said softly that silence is never neutral. It always serves someone, and it rarely serves the innocent. Wallace didn't defend himself. For the first time in their professional relationship, he looked smaller than her, not because she had taken something from him, but because he had finally seen what he had given away. When she stood to leave, he asked her if she thought people like him could change. She didn't give him false hope or comfort. She just said that change doesn't start with questions, it starts with action. Then she walked out. Later that evening, she visited Ayanna again. This time, they met at a park, far from any buildings or offices, just two women on a bench as the sun began to sink behind the trees. Ayanna had brought her younger brother, a quiet boy with big eyes who clutched a book like it was armor. Camille spoke with him gently, asked what he liked to read. He said science fiction, because it was the only place where black kids got to survive everything. That answer cut deeper than Ayanna's letter had. Camille looked at her and asked how she was holding up. Ayanna admitted she was still scared, more now than before, because when someone fights back, there's always someone else waiting to push harder. But then she said something that surprised Camille. She said, "I'm scared, but I'm not quiet anymore. And I think that matters." Camille nodded, emotion rising in her chest in a way she rarely allowed to surface. She told Ayanna that courage isn't loud. It's not what people think it is. Courage is staying upright when you're shaking. It's saying something small when the silence feels suffocating. And that every revolution, no matter how public it looks, starts with private decisions, like this one. Ayanna squeezed her hand, and for a long moment, they just sat there in silence, the weight of what they'd both survived sitting between them like an invisible third presence. The following morning, Camille received an unexpected call. It was from Jack's daughter, Maya. Her voice on the other end of the line was hesitant, guarded. She said she didn't know why she was calling exactly, only that she'd seen Camille on the news, and then again in that final briefing, and something in her wanted to understand. She wasn't calling to defend her father. She made that clear. She just wanted to understand how someone could carry so much pain without becoming bitter. Camille didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Because bitterness is a prison, and I've spent my life trying to be free." Maya asked if they could meet, and Camille agreed. They met in a quiet cafe 2 days later. Maya looked nothing like her father. Her energy was soft, cautious, reflective. She said that for years, she suspected her father wasn't the man he pretended to be in public. That there was a disconnect between the way he carried himself at home and the man he was in uniform. She described memories that made Camille's chest tighten, moments of control, of cold dismissals, of language too sharp for a child to forget. She said she wanted to be part of the solution, even if she carried his name. Camille told her that change doesn't always come from heroes. Sometimes it comes from those who carry the weight of broken legacies and choose not to pass them on. Maya cried quietly. Camille didn't try to stop her. Meanwhile, the investigation into the task force continued to unfold. More officers were suspended. Lawsuits began stacking up. Civil rights attorneys filed motions to reopen past cases that had been dismissed under suspicious circumstances. Camille worked with community leaders to establish an independent civilian oversight committee, something that had been proposed for years but always buried in bureaucracy. Now, with public trust shaken to its core, the idea found new momentum. She didn't lead the committee, she intentionally stepped back, knowing this part of the process belonged to the community itself. But she remained close, advising, listening, showing up in meetings not as the voice of authority but as a bridge. One night, as she walked to her car after a long day, she found a note tucked under her windshield. There was no name. Just 6 words written in shaky penmanship: "Because of you, I spoke up." She held the paper in her hands for a long time before sliding it into her coat pocket. It reminded her of something Miss Thelma used to say: "If one voice can shake the silence, it's already worth it." Camille drove home in silence, tears prickling her eyes, not from sadness, but from the quiet weight of impact. Jack, meanwhile, had started therapy. Not because he wanted to at first, but because the alternative was drifting into a kind of madness he could no longer mask. His therapist was an older black man, sharp-eyed and unafraid to push back. Their sessions began in silence. Jack refused to say much. But over time, he broke. He spoke of the pressure to dominate, the fear of seeming weak, the way the badge had become a mask he forgot how to take off. He admitted that somewhere along the line, he stopped seeing people and started seeing threats. And that when Camille looked him in the eyes and didn't flinch, something inside him cracked. One day, he asked the therapist if redemption was real. The man replied, "Redemption isn't something you get. It's something you give others by making space for their pain to matter more than your excuses." Jack sat with that for a long time. He didn't know what to do with it. But he didn't forget it. And so, the city shifted. Not all at once. Not in grand gestures. But in small, deliberate movements. Officers underwent new training, not just on procedures but on bias and community accountability. The courthouse installed public reporting kiosks for misconduct, ensuring no complaint would be buried again. Camille's office received national recognition, but she declined most interviews. She wasn't interested in fame. Her victory wasn't in headlines, it was in every woman who now walked into a courtroom without fear, every young man who saw someone in power who looked like them and chose justice over silence. Still, Camille felt the weight of it all. The cost. The loneliness. The constant threat that power, once threatened, would strike back harder. And yet, she woke up each day with resolve. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Because for every step forward, there was still someone waiting to be heard. And soon, a decision would be made. Not in a court. Not on the news. But in a room. Between 2 people. One last conversation. One final moment. That would change everything. The final hearing took place in a private room at the Department of Justice, far from the flashing cameras and noise of public commentary. It wasn't televised, and there were no reporters in the hallway. Just a heavy, deliberate silence. Jack had been summoned not as a defendant, not yet as an inmate, but as a man facing the full weight of the choices he could no longer hide from. He didn't walk in with lawyers this time. He came alone. Across from him sat Camille, composed as ever, her eyes focused not on revenge but on resolution. There was no anger in the room, no gloating, only consequence and clarity. She began the meeting with a list of names, not of victims, but of officers who had worked alongside Jack in the task force. Some had been disciplined, others had cooperated. A few were already facing charges. Jack sat silently, his hands folded in his lap, until Camille paused and looked up. She told him that the department had reviewed his cooperation over the past few weeks and acknowledged his willingness to provide information that led to further investigations. But then she made it clear, this was not a bargaining chip. Redemption, she said, is not earned through desperation. It's earned through understanding, through change, and most of all, through truth. Jack looked at her, his face no longer hard or proud. He asked her what she believed he should do next. Her answer was quiet, but unwavering. Tell the truth. All of it. Publicly. Not to save yourself, but because the silence has done enough damage. In a rare and unexpected decision, Jack agreed. A week later, he sat down for a live, unscripted interview. Not with a media outlet seeking ratings, but with a community justice panel, moderated by activists, survivors, and organizers. The broadcast was raw and direct. He spoke of his past, his abuse of power, his failure to see people as people. He didn't defend himself. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply acknowledged every act, every cover-up, every lie he told himself to sleep at night. The response from the public was deeply divided. Some saw it as a first step toward reconciliation, others as too little, too late. But Camille, watching from her office, didn't need the world's approval. She needed one thing, that the truth no longer belonged to the shadows. As for Maya, Jack's daughter, the aftermath of her father's reckoning was complex. She continued to distance herself from his legacy, but she also began speaking at community events, often alongside Camille. She never excused him, but she used his downfall as a lesson about how deeply rooted silence and bias can be, even inside the home. In one particularly emotional event, she read aloud from her journal, describing the moment she realized her father was part of the very system that had traumatized her friends. Camille stood beside her, listening with the same steadiness that had dismantled an entire culture of impunity. Deputy Chief Wallace, after months of introspection and growing public pressure, submitted his resignation with a statement that acknowledged his failures and pledged to support the incoming reforms from the outside. In a surprising move, he began volunteering at local youth programs, offering mentorship not as a figure of authority, but as someone willing to learn. He met with community leaders regularly, not as a representative of power, but as a man seeking to rebuild trust. It wasn't redemption, it was restoration, slow and earned. Ayanna graduated that spring with honors. She was offered a full scholarship to study public policy and had already been recruited by a grassroots justice organization. Her voice became one of the most powerful to emerge from the aftermath, not loud, but piercing. Her presence was a quiet resistance, a symbol of a generation no longer willing to be silenced. On the night of her graduation, Camille received a letter from her. It simply read, "You gave me the courage to be seen. Thank you for standing before I knew how to." And Camille, she didn't take a promotion, though it was offered. She declined every award, every spotlight interview, every attempt to turn her story into a brand. Instead, she returned to the community that raised her. She reopened a small outreach center in Jackson Ward that her grandmother had once volunteered in. It became a space for listening sessions, legal clinics, and youth mentorship. But more than that, it became a place of healing. She split her time between the center and her oversight duties, building new leadership, creating space for more voices at the table, particularly women of color who had long been overlooked in positions of accountability. Her legacy wasn't a plaque, it was a pathway. Years later, at a policy summit focused on nationwide reform, Camille was asked to speak. She stood before an auditorium of lawmakers, students, and organizers and told them that justice isn't an event, it's a process. That accountability doesn't end with punishment. It begins with the decision to never let silence win again. Her words didn't roar, they resonated. And when she stepped down from the podium, there was no thunderous applause, only a stillness, as if everyone understood that real change is quiet at first. It whispers. Then it builds. Now, as we reach the end of this journey, it's important to ask ourselves what this story truly means. What happens when someone chooses to rise instead of stay silent? What kind of strength does it take to face the very system you're still a part of? And how do we measure justice, not by the fall of the guilty, but by the rise of those who dare to speak? Camille's story is not just one of triumph. It's one of cost, of courage, and of conviction. It's a reminder that power can corrupt, but it can also be reclaimed. That silence can protect, but it can also destroy. And that when one person decides to stand, it makes it easier for the next to do the same. So now, we ask you, the listener, what would you do when silence feels safer? What would you risk, to tell the truth? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share how this story made you feel. Who did you connect with most? What moment hit you the hardest? And if you felt something real in this story, if you were moved, inspired, or even challenged, be sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful stories just like this one, because sometimes, the biggest plot twist isn't what happens to a person, it's who they become after it.